Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for this month's Black History Series presentation. It happened in Amherstburg, Black History in Amherstburg. My name is Dr. Lorene Bridgen-Lennie. I'm the Assistant Curator here at the Amherstburg Freedom Museum, and I am joined by the Curator Mary-Katherine Whelan. And we're going to be giving you a presentation about significant sites of Black history in Amherstburg. What brought about this presentation was back in April, Mary-Katherine and I gave a Jane's Walk tour, which involved the properties that you're going to be hearing about today. And we had a great audience. There was lots of interest in our Jane's Walk, but we just thought for those who couldn't attend, who live outside the area, that we would also give the presentation so that others could hear it as well. So we'll go ahead and get started. This Jane's Walk tour is going to consist of properties on King Street, George Street, and Seymour Street as well. And so here's a list of the properties that we're going to be talking about today. So we'll start with, and also Mary-Katherine has this map here that she's created of the walk, just so you can kind of get a sense of what we did on the tour. So we're going to start with 277 King Street, and that is the Taylor Cabin. So the Taylor Cabin, it is known as the Taylor Cabin, and it's named after George Taylor, and he was a freedom seeker who escaped enslavement in Kentucky, but he also fought in the Civil War. He was honorably discharged and given $100 for his service, and then after the Civil War, he came to Canada in 1870, where he first resided in Anderton, and for those who aren't familiar with Anderton, it was its own separate community near Amherstburg, but now it is part of Amherstburg, and then George ended up moving later to Amherstburg, and that's where he ended up living with his son-in-law, Thomas Thompson, his daughter, Emma, and their daughter, Azalea, in this cabin. It was actually Thomas Thompson and Emma were the very first Black family to own this property. And just to give a little bit of details about Azalea, she was a school teacher and an active member of the Amherstburg First Baptist Church, which I'll be talking about towards the end of the tour. And she was a clerk at the church from 1934 or 1932 until 1944. So Azalea, she married a man named William Wilson, and he ended up taking over ownership of the property, and he lived there into the 1970s. And he updated the cabin and added things like electricity, heating, and also a kitchen and bathroom. The kitchen and bathroom no longer exists or is attached to the cabin. And interestingly, I was giving a tour to a visitor several years ago, and they'd mentioned they knew William Wilson, and he made the best cherry pie. So just it's interesting that when you get connections that people have to the people you're talking about in the cabin that actually knew them. So that was just a little piece of information that they shared. But yeah, so William Wilson ended up updating the cabin. It used to be right next door to the church, but it was moved to where it is now after the museum took over. So it wasn't just William Wilson who is connected to the cabin. There's also a freedom seeker named Nazar McCurdy. He is connected to this property as well. He is an important example, not only because of his connection to the cabin, but because he came to Canada as a free person. And oftentimes the narrative we hear is that people were born enslaved in the US and then they came to Canada and were freed there or here. But in this instance, Nazar was born enslaved, freed in the United States, and then he came to Canada. And then there were those also who were born free in the United States and decided to come to Canada as well. So there are no two stories that are the same. People could enter Canada in different ways, and not everyone gained their freedom once they came to Canada. So the narrative is different for each person. Nazar and his son, they ended up building up the second floor of the cabin from a small attic space to a livable second story. Now, Nazar, he was a carpenter and he helped build other spaces like the Nazar AME Church, which I'm going to talk about towards the end of or at the last property of the tour. And also, as I mentioned, the First Baptist Church, I'll be sharing more information about that as well. But Nazar, he was very influential once he came to Canada as well. He was a school board trustee and politically involved in the community. And as I mentioned before, the property remained in William Wilson's possession until it was sold to the founders of the Museum in the early 1970s. And when the house was erected on the property, it was only a few feet from the church, as I mentioned, but now it's relocated onto the grassy area that's connected to the main building where it stands today. And it's also important to note that the descendants of both William Wilson and the McCurdy family, they still reside in Windsor, Essex, and are very active here as well.
So now I'm going to talk about the property at 281 King Street. And so this is known as the Melvin Mac Simpson residence. In 1908, Jerome Simpson and his wife Mabel McCurdy, parents of the Amherstburg Freedom Museum founder Melvin Mac Simpson, were the first Black persons to own the property. And Jerome remained the owner of this lot until his death in the 1950s. In the article, An Old House as the Basis of a Dream, Jerome's son Max says that although both his parents had been born in the neighborhood, that they encountered opposition to the move. And Max said, area residents didn't want a Black man to move in, but my dad was determined to stay even if he had to lick everyone on the block to do so. Jerome himself, he worked for many years with the Boblo Island Excursion Company for over 50 years. According to author and Collections coordinator Meg Ryan, in 1920, the Simpsons made some changes to the residence. The house itself was raised, a bungalow roof was put in, and electrical lights were installed. And after Jerome passed, Max Simpson and his wife Betty Johnson, they lived in the house on the property until, Mac, he passed away in 1982, and Betty, who continued living in the residence until she passed much later on in 2014. Mac and Betty, for those who don't know, they're the founders of the North American Black Historical Museum, now known as the Amherstburg Freedom Museum. And this image here is an image of Jerome Simpson, Mac's father. After Mac passed away, Betty carried on their mission and she became the vice president of the board of directors. Melvin Simpson Residence is actually the only known existing building in Amherstburg made of log frame with brick construction with original clapboard siding. And this here's an image of Mac and Betty. They're actually in the parking lot of the museum where it is now today, which is just right adjacent to the residence in which they lived.
So now we're going to move to the next street over onto Seymour Street and talk about 294 Seymour Street. So this property was bought at a public sale of lands that was held at Sandwich, which for those unfamiliar with the geography of this area, Sandwich is now part of Windsor, Ontario, but it was its own separate community previously. And it was purchased on August 17th, 1836 by Henry Turner, who was a grocer in Amherstburg. He and his wife, Rosina, there's different spellings of her name, but that I've encountered, but they both escaped enslavement in West Virginia and Kentucky in 1828. Henry and Rosina opened a grocery store and rooming house in Amherstburg in addition to making and selling carpets. And according to a list for Captain Caldwell's company, Henry also served during the Upper Canada Rebellion. The 1861 census also indicates that Henry Turner owned assets valued at $1,600, which is quite impressive for that time. And after Turner's death in 1863, his widow, Rosina, she continued to occupy the house on Seymour Street. And it was Rosina's son, James Turner, who became a tenant on part of the lot while Rosina occupied the other part herself. And then James, he ended up renting the Amherstburg property until he mortgaged the house in 1882. And when the property was for sale at an auction, there was no bidder above $250, so the property went to Martha Thompson. In 1921, Thompson sold the house to Delos Rogers Davis Jr., who was the son of Delos Rogers Davis Sr., who was the first Black person to be appointed to King's Council in Canada. And Mary-Katherine's going to be talking about him at the next property. But another important person connected to this property of the Turner family is Julia Turner. She was born on July 4th, 1829. And by the time she was 14 years old, she was already teaching. She had completed her education at Oberlin College and earned her teaching certificate. She taught at schools throughout Essex County, including those in Mount Pleasant, Colchester, Amherstburg, Sandwich, and the Marble Village School, which is in Anderton. Not only did Julia experience racism on a daily basis as a teacher of a segregated school, but she also experienced sexism as a female teacher. In 1856, she was actually forced out of an Amherstburg school because parents and trustees thought that a male teacher would be better suited to managing the students. But she's known for other important reasons. In her obituary, she's described as a frugal woman who possessed great thrift, and she accumulated considerable property during her lifetime. She had farms in Malden, Anderton, Colchester North, and town property in Sandwich and Amherstburg, and she also invested. Upon her death, her real estate impressively was valued at $4,200, while her personal estate was worth roughly $1,800, also impressive. She owned at least 19 properties throughout Windsor, Essex, including 296, 298 Seymour Street, which was located right next door. And if you recall in the previous picture, there's a portion of a property that is the place that. Thank you. So if you see, there's a little bit of a cut off there, but that is the other property that she did own as well. And I think that's important because it's important to see examples of the property that she did own. It makes it real. And I mean, the fact that a woman at this time was owning that many properties, I think is incredibly impressive. And I know that there were other Black women who were owning properties at this time, but unfortunately, there's not as many records that talk about it. So we're very lucky to have information about her. But the money that she earned as a teacher, it helped her to support her family. And Julia is, again, among the many examples of Black women who acted as breadwinners in their community. Additionally, with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which caused a flood of freedom seekers to come to this region, to Southern Ontario, it meant that there was an increased need to educate newcomers. And Julia was among those who contributed to the education of numerous freedom seekers and their descendants as well.
So now we're going to talk about the property at 159 Gore Street. And this is the Delos Davis law practice. This property is connected to the Amherstburg lawyer Delos Davis. Delos was born on August 4th of 1843, and he became the third Canadian Black lawyer in the history of Canada, but also the first Underground Railroad freedom seeker to become a lawyer in Canada. And it really wasn't an easy journey for Delos, and he had to overcome many obstacles. On June 19th of 1873, he actually qualified to practice as a notary public, but racism prevented him from finding a lawyer willing to work with him so that could gain further experience. Before taking the entrance exam, it was required that individuals studying law must article for a period of time under the guidance of a lawyer, but Delos could not find anyone who obliged his request. And in 1884, he was able to convince William Balfour, who was an MPP for Amherstburg, to introduce a special law that actually permitted him to act as a lawyer. But he had to pass a test from the Law Society of Upper Canada and pay a standard fee before the law would take into effect. He did pass the exam, and he was sworn in on May 19th of 1885. The following year, William Balfour, he introduced a second special request, which allowed Delos to become a barrister upon passing the exam. He was called to the bar on November 15th of 1886, and in the following year, in 1887, he started a law practice in Amherstburg. So among the locations of Davis's law practice is 159 Gore Street. From 1889 until 1909, his law office, Davis and Davis, was located here. So this is right on the corner of Seymour and Gore, and that's the property there itself. Although Delos focused on criminal and municipal law, his specialty was drainage litigation. He was also appointed to King's Counsel on November 10th of 1910, and he was the first Black person to have this honor in the whole of the British Empire. Two of Delos' sons, Delos Jr. and Fred, they continued their father's legacy of practicing law. Delos Jr. became a conveyancer, who was basically in charge of transferring the legal title of property from one owner to the other, and a notary public. Fred Homer Alfonso Davis became the second Black lawyer to be called to the Ontario bar, and when Delos Davis Sr. died in 1915, Fred succeeded his father as town solicitor and held this position until his own death in 1926. Fred's specialties were real estate and municipal law. Fred H. Davis moved the law office to a building on the west side of Sandwich Street South near the corner of Murray Street in 1909, and in 1911, Fred Davis bought the building located at 254 Ramsey Street for his own law office.
Okay, we're going to go further down Seymour Street to 249 Seymour Street. And this property has a little bit less information than the other properties we had, but still very significant. It was Peter Jackson who built a house on this property. Peter Jackson was an African American who was born circa 1799, and he arrived from the US to Canada circa 1827. Peter, he married a woman named Sarah Jackson and occupied the lot since 1837, 1838, and purchased it from the Crown in 1850. Now, Peter Jackson died about 1871, and upon his death, he gave all of his real estate and personal property to his wife, Sarah. And Sarah remained on the property until 1881 and passed away a few years later in 1883. And the house that Sarah lived in may or may not be the original structure that they lived in. It may have been rebuilt. According to local historian Doris Gaspar, in 1839, Peter J. Jackson was instrumental in choosing and procuring the property for a church for, quote, the colored inhabitants. He wrote a letter to the land board telling them which lots he thought would be suitable for the church. And Peter Jackson, he's also noted as one of the trustees of the congregation of the Baptist Church when the government granted the property to the trustees for the site of a church meeting house or chapel. And this property was lot 27 on the west side of George Street, which was the First Baptist Church, now located at 232 George Street, which again, I'll be talking about towards the end of the tour.
So now we're going to talk about 145 Murray Street. So there's no photo of the building owned by James Smith and his family as it was torn down in 1945. James Smith, who was a grocer, was located on the southwest corner of Murray and Seymour Streets. He was a tenant of Joachim Renault. James Smith himself died of consumption during the 1860 at the age of 36. And James himself was born into slavery in Virginia, and his half brother was actually his owner. And in 1847, James Smith escaped to the Free States but left the United States in 1850 when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. He married his wife Elizabeth a few days before they came to Canada. In 1856, American abolitionist Benjamin Drew visited Upper Canada, now Ontario, and conducted interviews with Black settlers, which resulted in the book The Refugee, or The Narratives of Fugitive Slaves in Canada. James Smith is among those who were interviewed. So I'm just going to read a passage here from what James Smith told Benjamin Drew. He said, I was raised on the headwaters of the South Branch of the Potomac in Pendleton County, Virginia. The treatment there is mild, if there can be any mildness to it. I remained there until my escape in 1847. My father was a white man and was my master too. My mother's father was also a white man. My master was an Englishman born in the city of London. When I was 5 years old, he gave me to his son, who was my half brother, and he raised me. This son had then children about my age, and these children were sent to school, but I was not. These children talked about learning me, but they said, we mustn't. Father says he'll write a pass and run off. I have learned to read since I came away. I was ordered about like other slaves. I ate in the kitchen while they, my brother's family, ate at the table by themselves. I was stuck off to one side. Other people mentioned my relation to my master, but I never mentioned it to him, nor he to me. His sons had it thrown at them that we favored one another. It was looked on as a stigma. My mother often told me how it was, but told me not to mention it as it would make it worse for her. She died before her master. So, James Smith's narrative is quite long, but he ends it by saying, I'm doing tolerably well in Canada and I'm getting a very comfortable living. I own a lot of land worth about $200 and I have other property. I keep a grocery and sell to all who will buy without distinction of color. So you can find Benjamin Drew's narrative online if you search for it through the website Documenting the American South. So you're welcome to have a look at the full narrative that James Smith told Benjamin Drew, at that website.
Okay, we're going to switch to the next street over to King Street and look at 246 King Street. So this is quite a significant spot in Amherstburg's Black history. It's the King Street School. And in 1853, a segregated school was built in Amherstburg, but the location is unknown of the original location. The school operated under poor conditions until 1864 when the property was purchased on the west side of King Street. This building was built in 1878 and became the King Street School, a segregated school for Black students in Amherstburg. Now, segregation is not often something associated with Canada. Oftentimes we look to the United States to talk about that, but segregation did happen in Canada and it was by law in terms of education. According to the Common School Act of 1850, a community could enforce a segregated school if they wished it so. So unfortunately, there were opportunities for larger groups of white people to force segregated schools upon a community. But this act did not mean that every school in the province was segregated, but it did give the option to do so if a community wished it so. The last segregated school in the province was SS number 11 in Colchester, which is not very far from Amherstburg, just a short drive. And that school closed in 1965 thanks to the efforts of teachers, parents, community organizations, and leaders, but also students. You can't discount the voices of students as well. And they forced the closure of this school. And also that law was taken off the records at that point too. The school was used until 1909, 1910 when it closed down and the students were transferred to a new school in Richmond on Richmond Street. It was then used as a military barracks in 1914 to house recruits during World War I. And after this, the building was converted into what is now at present time Mount Beulah Church, which is still active today and very supportive of the museum, I should add. Now that we've talked about the building itself, I just want to share some information about three of its teachers, John Alexander, Julia Turner, and John H. Alexander. The first one being John Underwood. He was the first teacher, and he was hired under the condition that he furnish a classroom and provide firewood to heat it. The money for this actually came out of his salary. And Mr. Underwood rented the classroom from a man named Mr. Lewis and taught there until 1854, the 1854 school year when Julia Turner succeeded him as the teacher. Now, Julia Turner, you may recall I was talking to you about her on Seymour Street and all the properties that she owned. But I did also mention that she experienced sexism after being forced out of the King Street School because parents and trustees thought that a male teacher would be better at managing the children. So this is the school that I was talking about. Now, next is John Alexander. He's probably the most well-known, when you look at the history, the most well-known teacher connected to the school because of how long he taught there. He taught there, he actually had a teaching career from 1878 to 1917 at several schools, and his career began at Puce and North Buxton in 1878, but he remained at the King Street School for over 30 years, which is quite impressive. When he first started, he had an enrollment of 62 students. And after his retirement as a teacher, he took a position at the Brudermond, Canada, Limited in the Lime Department. In 1923, he was elected as a councilman of the town of Amherstburg, and he served in that capacity from 1923 to 1926. And in 1930, he was appointed town assessor and retained this position until ill health forced him to retire in 1934. At different times, he was also the town auditor. And impressively, several of his children actually became teachers as well, including Ethel, Arthur, and Nina May. And you can learn more about many of the families that we've talked about today, including the Alexander family, the Wilson family. Mary-Katherine's going to talk about the Crawford family as well. And the Binga family too. So there's many families that you can learn more about in the family history series that I write that's published on our website, amherstburgfreedom.org.
So next we're going to talk about 250 King Street, which is literally right next door to the Mount Beulah Church. And according to Doris Gaspar, a local historian, on June 22nd, 1867, Hiram Kirtley took over the property at 250 King Street. Gaspar adds that James Henry Kirtley and his wife Ella, they actually lived on the property with James's mother Fanny, and around 1914 to 1915, James built the house that is now located at 250 King Street. And if you look closely, you can actually see J.H. Kirtley, which is written in the cement in front of the house. So I've got it there in the bottom image. And it's just right on the pathway right in front of the house. And he actually worked as a chef on a steamer ship. So we don't have a lot of information about the Kirtleys, but we just thought it was really interesting because there is, that many years later, over 100 years later, his name is still in the cement in front of his former home.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about properties on George Street. So starting with 232 George Street. And I've mentioned several times throughout the tour that I was going to talk about the Amherstburg First Baptist Church, a very significant property. Local tradition maintains that sometime in 1838, a meeting occurred for the purpose of establishing a Baptist church in Amherstburg, and the building was erected on the property a few years later. It was built with the assistance of master carpenters Deacon George Crawford, who Mary-Katherine is going to talk about at the next property, but also Nathan McCurdy, who you may recall from the first property that I talked about with the Taylor cabin and how he built up the second floor of the cabin. And he was part of the Methodist Church. This church acted as a terminus of the Underground Railroad, just like the Nazar Church, which I'll talk about later on, where abolitionist and Underground Railroad conductor, the Reverend Anthony Binga Sr., was the first pastor of the First Baptist Church. Reverend Binga was also a freedom seeker who was born enslaved in Greene County, Kentucky. In 1895, he was interviewed by William H. Siebert, who was the author of the Underground Railroad from Slavery to Freedom. But in a separate document that Siebert wrote, the Reverend Binga shared his story. He said, quote, John Bucknell was my first owner, and when I was 6 years old, he sold my family to General Taylor, an uncle of Zachary Taylor, the 12th President of the United States. I never saw a day since I knew anything that I didn't want to be free. Fortunately, this dream did come true and became a reality in 1836 when he escaped. It was after his brother found a pocketbook with $500 inside of it that Anthony and some of his relatives, including his brother, made their way to Amherstburg, Ontario, with the assistance of Quakers and Underground Railroad operatives. The Binga family arrived 6 days after finding the pocketbook that changed their fate. And as mentioned, the Reverend Binga was a conductor of the Underground Railroad. And in an account of his time in Amherstburg, he said, at Amherstburg, I kept a station where when we went there first, it was almost a miracle to see 15 coming there at one time and a wonder when one came. A long time after, they would come 30 in a day, and after the fugitive slave law took effect, by 50s every day like frogs in Egypt. Now, this is a really important account because the Underground Railroad was such a secretive network that we don't often have accounts that talk about specific numbers. So we're very lucky to have the Reverend Binga's account of his work as a conductor in the Underground Railroad. As a conductor, Elder Binga assisted freedom seekers by providing them with food, shelter, clothing, and that would help them and also help them when they were sick. And he also helped them find employment as well. And it wasn't just the Reverend Binga; there was a whole network of people that assisted as well in helping. But Reverend Binga played a large role in that. The church's existence can also be attributed to the Reverend Binga Sr., who was also known as the walking preacher and the father of the Black Baptists. And I'm going to explain why. This was because the Reverend Binga raised money to build the Baptist church by traveling and preaching from Detroit to Toronto, if you can imagine walking that distance. And it was also common for him to walk from Amherstburg to Buxton, where he would stop at homes along the way to pray or enjoy a meal, get some rest as well. And so that's why he's considered the walking preacher. But he also deserves credit for playing an integral role in uniting Black Baptist churches in Ontario. It was in 1841 that the First Baptist Church hosted a meeting after there was a call to unite Black churches in the area because they could not enjoy the privileges they wished with white churches that excluded them. So this resulted in the formation of the Amherstburg Regular Baptist Association, which is more well known today as the Amherstburg Regular Missionary Baptist Association. And this group consisted of Baptist churches throughout Ontario and a few in Michigan, and Amherstburg is considered the mother church of this organization.
So now we're going to talk about the property at 217 Gore Street. So now we're going back towards the museum, towards King Street. So George M. Crawford and his wife Laura, Virginia Sidney, along with their family, they lived at the property at 217 Gore Street. George Crawford, he came to Canada as a young man, and according to the Amherstburg Echo, he became a master carpenter, and many of the houses he built in Amherstburg of timbers and lumber that had to be hewn and dressed in the bush are still standing as proof of their sturdy construction. The First Baptist Church is one of them. Laura escaped enslavement in Covington, Kentucky at the age of 15 and journeyed via the Underground Railroad through Oberlin, Ohio, and found freedom later in Amherstburg. It was in Amherstburg that George and Laura met and married, and Laura's escape is actually documented in the book Reminiscence of Levi Coffin. And Levi Coffin, for those who don't know, is considered the father of the Underground Railroad, and we have an image of Levi Coffin, I guess, to my right. Laura and George Crawford are the parents of Annie Crawford, who later married John Alexander, the teacher and principal for the King Street School. Annie was a lifelong member of the First Baptist Church. And so we have an image of John and his family, as well as Annie inset in front of the house.
Okay, next is 273 King Street. We're back on King Street again. And this is the final property we're going to talk about. We're back to where we started on the museum's property. This is the Nazarene African Methodist Episcopal Church, and it was constructed in 1848, but the congregation existed as far back as 1826. The congregation was established by the Reverend Noah C.W. Cannon, along with a group of church trustees who purchased the land for the church. It is named after the Bishop Willis Nazarene, who led many congregations, including this one, from the American-based AME Church Conference into the new Canadian-based British Methodist Episcopal Church. The denomination flourished until the 19th century when many dwindling congregations consolidated and reunited with the AME Church. The Nazarene AME Church was built by freedom seekers escaping enslavement and free Black persons escaping oppressive laws in the United States. But it should be pointed out as well is that freedom seekers and free Black people, they did not escape these oppressive laws and discrimination and racism that still is a problem that exists in our country today, but they certainly did experience that once they came into Canada. So they weren't escaping it, but there was some form of escape from the United States. It was built to serve Amherstburg's growing Black community, and it was a terminus of the Underground Railroad, just like the First Baptist Church I just talked about. And upon arrival in Amherstburg, freedom seekers found that the Nazarene Church played a significant role in their new lives, offering itself as an interim resting place until permanent housing could be found for freedom seekers. It also provided food, shelter, and clothing, in addition to serving as a school to educate those who had been denied that privilege. It was also a social center where numerous everyday skills were taught, and the community could come together to discuss issues that concern them. Again, I mean, significantly racism and discrimination that they encountered. It was a safe space for freedom seekers and Black settlers to come to talk about what concerned them, and also, too, importantly, how do we combat that, and how do we come together as a community to combat that racism and discrimination. At its peak, the Nazarene Church was a congregation of roughly 70 to 75 people. With time, the congregation was reduced to only 5 members, including the museum's founders, Mac and Betty Simpson. And in 1971, the 5 remaining members of the church congregation purchased the property, including the Taylor cabin where we started the tour. In 1975, an annex was attached to the front of the church, and that was built by the last 5 members of the congregation. Before the main building was constructed, this annex acted as the museum space where artifacts were stored and displayed. It was called the Reverend L.O. Jenkins Memorial Hall in honor of Reverend Lloyd Jenkins, who was the last pastor of the Nazarene AME Church. The structure was used until the main museum building was built on opened on September 20th, 1981. And the last service of the Nazarene Church was in 1988. The Nazarene AME Church is still a treasured National Historic Site as well, so very important to Amherstburg's history. So thank you so much for joining us for our presentation today. If you do want to learn more, we are on social media on TikTok, Facebook, X, and Instagram. This video will also be uploaded to our YouTube page, as are all the other Black History Series presentations. And if you did want to learn more as well about the local Black families that I write about, you can go to our website, amherstburgfreedom.org, as well to learn more. So thank you so much for joining us. If anyone does have any questions, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, we will end today's presentation. So I'll go ahead and check the chat if you have any questions. Okay. It doesn't look like we have any questions in the chat and no one's hands are raised, so we will go ahead and end that there. Also, if you would like to support programming like the Black History Series, you can go to our website to make a donation. It is greatly appreciated and helps us continue to share this very important content and history that is often not recognized, but should be. So thank you to everyone who joined us in the audience today, and thank you so much for joining us today.